there's so much investment in healthcare right now.
What is charge capture?
They now have to understand. They have to be involved and they have to be engaged.
Hello and welcome to the RevTech Rx Podcast powered by Streamline Health. I'm David Kozlowski. Today we're talking about how KLAS helps identify market needs for providers. And alongside me today, I've got Dustin Cragun, who is the VP of Revenue Cycle Management at KLAS Research. Dustin, thanks for coming on.
Hey, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. And then also Jawad Shaikh, our Chief Strategy Officer at Streamline Health. Jawad, thanks for being here again.
Glad to be here as usual.
Yeah, you're becoming a regular. I feel like we're just gonna save a seat for you, and it's gonna say Jawad on it. Yeah,
There you go. Love it.
awesome. So let's get right into it. Dustin, how did you, or how did KLAS in the beginning create? What did they create in terms of categories to initially get the start of KLAS Research?
Yeah, interesting question. So KLAS started about 26 years ago. I was not around at that time, but looking, I guess back at history, when KLAS first started, there really were no categories, right? It was the mission was to create this transparency around vendor IT performance. And so I know it was really just going out and doing some surveys on some products, software products and services, and then aggregating that information and then usually publishing that into a report. We kind of joke a little bit. Back then, I believe that the survey was multiple, like almost 100 questions, and it would take like an hour. And of course, 26 years ago, it was like fax machines too. So you would like fax these evaluations. Can you imagine getting like a fax, filling that out and sending it back in. And we've obviously gotten a lot better in that time. The questions there's 20 questions, it's electronic. But the reality is, from there, it continued to grow to where we had enough products that we were able to create different market segments and, different categories, and even, to where we're at today, where we have best in class and we're able to have recognition, for those categories.
Yeah, I'm going to put you on the spot here.
Yeah.
So if you had to take a guess, how many categories do you have today?
I think we're up around 110. I do know that we've got, we're rating over 700 products. I think, so we've definitely come a long way since 26 years ago.
And in terms of adding, how do you prioritize, or what makes you determine this is a good category to add to our list?
Yeah, so there's really no exact science to answer that question. We are a energy company, if you think about it that way, right? So we follow what the providers are asking us about. And even backing up just a little bit, we have two primary customer stakeholders. We have the providers, and then we also have the vendors that we work with. So on the provider side, they are calling us and saying, hey, we're getting ready to go to an RFP, or we're making some type of decision. What information do you have, in this area? And so what happens is if we start getting a lot of questions around topics, we think, we need to provide transparency. So a couple of examples would be, recently with all of the recent federal regulations around price transparency, that went from literally zero energy to now all the providers are calling us who's doing what and how are these products working. Another example would be automation. So I think, RPA's been around for a long, long time, but for some reason, 5, 6, 7 years ago, the use cases, providers started to recognize use cases in RevCycle. And so suddenly that was going to be sort of the magic wand that would solve all of these problems. And so suddenly we created a segment to address that. So again, following energy is what's topical.
Yeah. Utilizing your terminology, I think it's important to note that Jawad, you at one point worked in hospitals, so we'll call that the provider for this, and then built a company from the vendor side. Jawad, when you were looking at KLAS, and we mentioned previously that obviously you really wanted to have best in class eventually, but when we were at Avelead, did you ever leverage the KLAS knowledge or reports to be able to determine, hey, this is a gap in healthcare? Here's why I want to build this product.
Yeah, and I think it kind of, one of the things that you run into is really, I call it, it's a vocabulary issue or messaging issue or even market confusion to understand, hey, this is what we do or what somebody else does. So there's a lot of vendors doing the same thing or similar things or doing it differently. And how do we differentiate ourselves from that? It was kind of always a challenge, either for the provider themselves to understand what we're trying to do, and even for the vendor of how we can kind of communicate what we're doing or what we're doing differently. So getting the categories right, or basically saying, hey, we do this and map it to, is this charge capture, is this revenue integrity, is this charge master management? All these things are somewhat related and sometimes they overlap a lot. So that was kind of was tough. So I think kind of mapping to the KLAS categories kind of helped a little bit to give a better or clear message to, providers to understand, hey, this is what they're talking about and how we can fit into it. So I think just being an innovative or being a new company, that's kind of always, because we're always trying to do something different, right? So it's trying to get aligned to that proper category.
And then I would add on the back end of that statement that we really design our segments around the lens that the providers are going to ask us about. So we try to say, hey, if a CIO or a VP of Rev Cycle is going to come to our website and want to know about Charge Master, as you mentioned, okay, who would belong, which logos would we have in that segment? And so it's very much driven by, I think, this orientation towards what providers what problems they're trying to solve, and then who should be in there. But we'll have one vendor that is actually in multiple segments if they have multiple products, doing multiple things.
Yeah, it's interesting. Do you feel, and Jawad, I don't know if you know this or not, but how quickly can KLAS sort of keep up on the categories, a new addition of categories? And in response to, like, when you were creating RevID, was that an option for KLAS at the time, or?
No, I think it's tough because we're a differentiator. There's a lot of companies out there that says, oh, well, going to help you find missing charges, or we're going to do this. So the end result could be the same, and they happen across multiple categories, right? That's the challenging part. Like, we'll be on the, hey, you got to do this on the patient access side. You got to do this on the charge capture side. You got to do this like on the coding side now. So we have one solution that's maybe touching multiple areas. I think that was more kind of challenging. And then we were just speaking to is like, all right, we kind of is one product, it's one solution, but it does touch those different categories as well too.
Yeah, and one thing that I would add on that is that, for us, so there's a lot of companies that do research, right? And we have I think a unique approach to that. But our data is rooted in actual current use cases. So if you think about emerging technology, we will hear about like this emerging technology, and the vendor might only have 2 customers. Well, we can talk to those 2 customers, but we're not sure that that's a large enough story to tell about the long-term performance of that vendor. And so we like to see a little more like a larger customer base so that we can ultimately tell that story. So in that regard, though, when you look at like when segments come on, there also is this, well, are customers actually using this? And by the way, I mean, I think it's a great benefit to providers because it does cut through the smoke and mirrors. If people are making these audacious promises about, hey, like buy this product and all your wildest dreams will come true, we've actually heard, I think in the last couple of years, we're saying, hey, no, we went and talked to them. This is who's using it. This is what they're using it for. And we validated that. And I think that's a powerful story.
When you mentioned price transparency, how quickly did you have something?
No, the only thing I was going to add to that is because there's a lot of companies out there, like you mentioned RPA, and now today everything's about AI. Yeah. So there's a lot of cool technologies out there, and it's sometimes the technology's trying to push or drive, hey, you can do this with AI or you can do this with RPA, versus what's the business problem I'm dealing with and how can I use AI as a tool to make that kind of more efficient. And I think some of those KLAS categories, or it kind of says, hey, it's not about the technology itself, but it's about how we fix the business problem and use those technologies to fix the business problems.
It's a good clarification because my brain goes to, when you talk about price transparency, how quickly did KLAS jump on that category, if you will? I'm assuming it's a category. So how quickly do you feel like where it was like, all right, products are being developed, now we need to build this category and start auditing the tools?
Yeah, so actually price transparency is not a category for us. The reason for that is what we've seen is usually that solution is either part of the native offerings of the whole system, like the EMR itself, so the providers are just using that, or it's part of a larger piece of like patient access. And so we don't see that being a best in breed solution that's getting bought that way. It's more part of the platform. But to answer that question, I'll use the automation category. We kicked off a report, took us probably about 7 months to do, and we use reports, by the way, to really kind of help us with segments. So we'll go out, we'll grab a bunch of data, we'll present that as initial findings, and then we continue to then continue to get new evaluations and populate our website.
Yeah.
So a year,
Okay.
is loosely.
Is automation in the same category as artificial intelligence?
Yeah.
Machine learning?
So at KLAS, we've kind of got them separated a little bit. One that's more heavy on the clinical side and the use cases there. And then I have one over on my side, which is RevCycle, and the use cases specifically for RevCycle.
Interesting. Just random ask, but have you been noticing a lot more organizations starting to use the ML AI statement when they present their their company, like, hey, we're different. We're artificial intelligence, or we're machine learning. Is that something that you've been noticing a lot of, or?
Yeah, so it's a great question because it's a little bit fascinating. I would say if we went back maybe 4 or 5 years ago, maybe even 3 years ago, everybody was saying AI. Everybody was throwing that around, and to the point where it really kind of was ubiquitous with just automation in general. And in fact, I mean, there's a lot of automation tools. There's RPA and ML and NLP and all these things. And so for that span of time, no one really kind of questioned that. But what we were actually seeing at KLAS is that the AI use case, the actual utilization of the AI was very limited. In fact, you'd see mostly RPA with maybe like a little bit of AI. And by the way, these are generalized statements, right? But
Sure.
still,
Right.
I think this holds generally true for what we were seeing. It was still mostly screen scraping, RPA, those kind of things. And I also say that there's no problem with that technology. There is a great time to use that technology, but I think where the rub is you can't also then say you're AI
Right.
if it's powered by another technology that's not.
Yeah, it's a gap. I mean, do you guys acknowledge that or call that out?
Yeah, we do. And in fact, we feel like if you look at like the essence of KLAS, and by the way, we are not trying to do a gotcha on anybody. It's not, we don't every way wake up. It's like, hey, how can we get this group, what we do feel very passionately about is that we are amplifying the voice of the provider. So, maybe I've romanticized the story a little bit, but I mean, I love that when I talk to like a business office manager in a critical access hospital in the middle of nowhere, that she or he tells me the story and we publish that. So suddenly your little voice in the middle of nowhereville, USA has a megaphone associated with it. And so, that's what we love to tell is to amplify that story. And then what we would hear throughout that is, hey, by the way, this is just RPA. This is not AI. And we're like, okay, fine. Let's tell that story. So
Yeah. Do you, on your end, you find it as a pretty big buzzword still today?
And it definitely, it kind of goes back to the messaging and the market confusion, or we talk about is like, hey, this is what we do, or this is how we do it. And then whatever the buzzword of the day is, whether it's RPA or AI, those get thrown around, but it's macros, it's predictive analytics, it's all these different things, but it's all AI because that's the buzzword. And I think that's where organization like KLAS can kind of help basically say, this is what they're doing and there's the end result you're going to get, independent of the technology, or this is how this technology is working or not.
Yeah.
I was going to say one thing that's interesting too is as long as I've done this and listened to providers and listened to vendors, what I've ultimately come to is providers do not care if it's AI, RPA, or a hamster on a wheel, right? They just need an outcome.
Yep.
And they want a result. And I think we make too big of a deal a little bit about what's being used. And I say that knowing that, look, vendors have to differentiate themselves, and it is a long-term tactical advantage to use these tools. So I acknowledge that. I'm not downplaying that. I'm just saying, hey, look, at the end of the day, though, we care about if the provider is saying this works and it's fabulous, or this is not working.
Yeah. You can throw in all the buzzwords you want, but at the end of the day, they want something that works and is effective at what it says it's supposed to do. Yeah, I would agree.
Results and outcomes. Yep.
Exactly. Yeah. So this one kind of getting some meat of another area. Healthcare has been struggling since COVID quite a bit. Staffing challenges, all these issues that are buzzwords, and we know these problems. How is it impacting the operational performance or the financial performance, excuse me? And how do you see providers sort of responding to that?
Yeah, that's a tough one because I don't feel like there's a one size fits all. But clearly, if you talk to enough providers, you hear that there's staffing is number one, the staffing issue. And it's just not bodies. It's the fact that they're using travelers and per diem, and it's 3 and 4x the cost right? Which then immediately affects the second piece, which is financial performance. I mean, you don't have margin, you don't have the ability, to make investments. So quite candidly, I think their response is twofold. One, they have to figure out that staffing piece, which is kind of this, we're seeing a proliferation of like human capital management software and a lot of like scheduling software. But the other thing too that we're seeing is like virtual visits or virtual care or remote patient monitoring. We're seeing a big rise in that because those things immediately reduce the burden, the administrative burden of having people come to the facility and get care. So, digital like front door tools, we're seeing a proliferation of that. The second thing that providers are doing is, in last year, we actually co-authored a study with Bain Capital, or Bain Management rather. And we went out and talked to a lot of providers about what their intentions were with investments in the future. It was essentially a third said we are increasing our technology budget. A third said we're going to keep the budget the same. And a third says we are actually going to be pulling back. So if you look at the first 2/3, right, which is we're going to spend more or at least the same, we still think there's going to be a lot of money spent on technology to solve these problems. I mean, it's hard to imagine a way out of these problems without the utilization of technology. Now, that being said, what also came out of that report that I thought was interesting is it said about 70% of the providers said they were most likely going to be looking at their native host system or their native EMR for that possible solution and try to maximize like what's happening there. And then another was like 63% that said that their initiative was to optimize their existing tech stack, right? To say, hey, we've got all of these tools already, but because of employee turnover and you lose that skill set, we're not even utilizing what it is that we have. And so I believe that we're going to we'll see a pretty good spend on technology or services, but I also think people are going to really figure out how to optimize, the current situation.
Using it. Jawad, on the provider side originally, what do you think?
I kind of, if you look at just healthcare in the past, 10, 15 years, so it's kind of going back, and we were talking about some of this before we started, is that, on the clinical side, we made a lot of progress with the stimulus, the electronic medical records and implementations. And really the revenue cycle piece has been kind of behind the curve for a long time. So one of the things I was looking at is like a typical like 350 bed hospital, has, hundreds of people just trying to capture charges and dropping a bill, right? I was meeting with a hospital VP revenue cycle just a few weeks ago, and they have about 1,000 people that work in the revenue cycle department. So, I mean, that's a lot of people just trying to capture bills and things like that. What I think from a COVID perspective, hospitals lost a lot of revenue, elective surgeries, all those procedures are kind of down, and that kind of forced them to say, all right, what do we need to do? Because we're having all these staffing issues, we're having all these financial issues, can we kind of improve that? You can't just hire more people. That's not easy. So, technology is kind of the natural alternative. And being able to weed through all the technologies that are out there, what do we already have on the shelves that we already bought and maybe we're not using, as you were just saying, utilizing what we've got versus what's available to make things more either automated or more efficient by using the technologies that are out there and are available. I think it's kind of forcing people to look at it and maybe accelerating some of the things because of all these problems.
Yeah. And what you've talked about, both of you talked about some gaps, it sounds like, of opportunities that vendors could take advantage of, right, in the healthcare space. If you were to give suggestions or advice, what do you think the vendors should be focusing on, to make themselves more effective and imprint themselves more in the market?
Yeah, so I have 3 initial thoughts that I think might be helpful. So the first one is vendors are also affected by the staffing issues. So they've had their own turnover. They're struggling also hiring individuals. And they have also lost, I don't want to say a core competency, but when those employees turn over, you've got to bring somebody in who knows next to nothing about that vendor's products and solutions, right? But the vendors will still often roll that person out on the front lines to help. And so when providers call, they end up getting the runaround, not because the vendor's not trying to help, but you don't have people on the front end that are capable at that point to really help. One of the things that KLAS sees over and over, and we preach it, is vendors who empower their employees. And I'm talking about a really deep empowerment, like the ability to like, okay, you're going to make a really big decision and it might be costly, as in it might cost us a lot of money, but you're emboldened and empowered to make that decision because you're working with the provider and you're not going to let that provider fail. Like that's the culture of the vendor. Like I will not let you fail. So I will do what I need to do to take care of you. So that ability to empower really great employees, I think, is a differentiator for vendors who are always maybe turning some staff over or whatever. The second thing that I think kind of even ties into that a little bit is the last couple of years, I alluded to earlier, I feel like maybe healthcare vendors were selling more of a hope and a dream and an idea of where healthcare is going. And I love that about our industry because we have to constantly be pushing the envelope. But it feels like there's a time now where it's like we got to get back to meeting providers where they're at today. Like they need help right now with some very specific things, not, hey, in 3 years, this is what your life is going to be like with us, right? They need help right then. So I'd say meeting providers where they're at. And then the third one might feel a little bit random, but we do 25,000 evaluations a year. And so we have all sorts of data. And one of the questions we ask is around implementation. So we have implementation scores. And one of the things that we found is about 80% of vendors who win best in class. And for those that don't know, best in class is a designation that's given based off of the voice of the provider. So if the providers basically speak and score you, then you win, the vendor wins best in class. We don't do that. The provider does that. But 80% have the highest implementation scores, which is really fascinating. And it's probably, when you think about it, it's like maybe not surprising at all, because when you get people off on the right foot and you don't have to then pass and stress your organization's account management and support teams and training teams to pick up the pieces from a failed implementation. You don't have that cost, by the way. And the provider's off to a great start. They will really latch on to that vendor. And then you always have like first crack at any new business or anyway. So I would just say, vendors are always talking about, hey, we're coming up with this feature function. We're going to be doing this. We're going to be doing all of these things. But what I don't often hear is, this is how we're going to make implementations amazing for our new customers. I think there's a lot of value to that.
How many contenders are typically in for best in class? I want to get to the implementation question, but I want to first know, like, how many do you feel like are, hey, these are all in the running for best in class?
Yep. So every segment that we have is eligible for best in class. We don't create a segment. I guess the tactical approach is we have to have at least 2 vendors in that segment to make it a best in class segment. Now, candidly, we all agree internally, 2 vendors in a segment to win best in class isn't maybe the most robust thing you've ever heard, right? We're aware of that. So our job is to make sure that we've populated that segment with enough vendors that providers are asking us about to make it that feels like a very legitimate situation. By the way, we do have segments with only 2, but really they are the dominant 2. It's like, well, I don't want to use Ford and Chevy because you got a whole bunch of other auto manufacturers, but I mean, you've got the main logos in there. They're getting rated, and that's good enough. So that's how that works.
This is unscripted. In your opinion, what are the biggest gaps that you're noticing with implementation?
Really good question. So there's an interesting dynamic that I think over time providers have taken the approach, or they've come to expect, first of all, that the implementations are not going to go good, which is kind of saddening, but I think they've gone through enough in their life to go, I'm just expecting this is not going to go well. And that's not true. You can have a great implementation. But I think there's this feeling that it's something that is done to them versus something that is done with them. And so I would actually say that I believe that the providers, we always hold the vendors accountable and they need to do better, but providers have to have like a good governance on who's making these decisions and like, is it set up correctly? And if we decide to like have the system set up this way, that it aligns with our workflows, and it's not that we're going to turn it on and suddenly we realize our workflows are complete opposite of how we had that set up. And so I believe that the vendors who can help providers get to a better spot during the implementation is going to make, they're going to have the advantage. Now, I think vendors can always step up on just the implementation practices, but I think a lot of the core pieces are there, but there's just something lacking sometimes in that relationship during the implementation that just causes it to not click.
What's interesting is there are applications I know that they don't necessarily affect the entire hospital. They affect a very small department within the hospital. And those implementations I feel like I would assume are a lot easier to get done. Is this a fair assessment? Then you have these ones that are, and when I say easier, I mean, then you have the ones that hit a lot of areas in the hospital. Your product touches all these different areas, multiple users every single day. That, to me, when I'm hearing like get the providers more involved, that workflow of like nursing to CFO to, what's your big tip? I guess if I was to ask, like, what could you recommend any vendor to say, here's how you're going to get all these areas or all these people to play nicely with each other?
Yeah, it's funny you asked us that because KLAS is currently working on another evaluation tool where we're acting as sort of, I don't like to use the word middleman because we're not, but what we're doing is going in and we're actually talking to the providers and we're saying, hey, what from your perspective is not working well from the vendors? Like what do you need from them that you're not getting? Questions like that. And then we say the same thing though about the vendor to the vendor about the provider. And so it allows the vendor to go, hey, you know what we need? We've been waiting 3 months for this list or this data, and we don't have that. And so we went ahead and implemented without this data point or something, right? And so now that probably doesn't answer your question because it's like, well, what can you do on your own? But what we saw was there has to be an ability to really communicate candidly and openly in a way that solves problem. And I think it has to be with the right people on both sides, because what ends up happening is, you might have these side conversations going off and you go, great, if we're all aligned. But if that doesn't get to the director of IT, or if that doesn't get up to the CFO and have them go, wait a minute, no, we can't do it that way, then you still have a problem. So yeah, no, that's a big challenge, but that's the nut that has to get cracked, on these implementations.
Yeah.
Just a couple of things is, the whole conversation about implementations is really near and dear to my heart. I've done hundreds of those, and I think David knows a little bit of my history as well too. But the most successful ones I've seen is, and you said it early on, is where the governance or the buy-in is really coming from the provider, right? They're saying, this is what we want to do, and then they can even hold the vendors, right, accountable, right, to say we're doing it the way we want to. There's so many times, especially in these smaller ones, they're like, I'm expecting A, but I got A1 or AB or something like that. So it's not exactly the same. And that kind of leads into implementation, that leads into adoption, and then the longevity of as well too. So that's why a lot of client success programs, things like that, it almost has to be technology and service together for it to continue to work and have clear expectations and governance from the beginning.
Sure. I really I want to leave this with making sure that it is echoed one more time. I really like how you said, the big one from the vendor side, empower your people, give them the opportunity to make a big decision that specifically helps the client or the provider and getting them further along in their process. The second one was meeting the provider where they're at, right? And then the last one is implementation, which is probably personally, the one that I also hold dear to my heart is making sure that implementation goes well, right? We can sell all day long, but if we can't implement and execute appropriately, what was the point? So I really appreciate those 3 notes. Seriously. It's awesome. Any other last notes any of you have?
No, it's great. A lot of opportunities out there, and it's just like you said, just keep the focus on the business problems you're trying to solve. Don't get lost in the buzzwords, AI, especially these days, is what I say. It's focus on the outcome and the results.
Yeah. And then I'll just say one final thing. It's just a plug for humankind. Like seems like at times it's easy to pit vendors against providers and to point fingers. And, I have a lot of empathy for clinician burnout and administrative burnout and what we're seeing on providers. And we go to get healthcare and we expect people who have burning out to give us great service, right? And yet they get mistreated and all of those kind of things. And so, and then on the vendor side too, vendors are challenged very much with staffing and issues and budget. They have budget crunches as well. And so look, at the end of the day, we're all consumers of healthcare and we just got to take care of each other, right? We got to just have a little bit more empathy, I think, in all areas. and we'll move forward, So anyway, just a plug for humankind.
All
How's
you,
on this?
he got that from ChatGPT. It wrote
Yeah,
that
I
for
did.
him. He used AI.
I used AI for that final piece.
That's cool. Awesome. Well, I appreciate you so much, Dustin, for having us out here in Salt Lake City and getting you on the podcast. It means a lot. So thanks for helping set this up. Jawad, thank you for joining us and getting on a flight right before. I know you've been traveling like crazy, so it's good to get you in here. And thanks everyone for listening in to the RevTech Rx podcast powered by Streamline Health. Make sure you like, subscribe, share if you enjoyed the content. And again, I'm David Kozlowski. Take care. Hey, before you go, do you have a topic that you want us to cover, or do you know an industry expert who could join us? Send us a message through LinkedIn and turn your ideas into new episodes right here on RevTech Rx.